Welcome back, Cyclings. As promised, now we're going to talk about cognitive, social, and personality changes in adulthood and old age. So, the first one here, like I said, we're going to talk about the social and emotional changes that occur during adulthood. So, the first thing we have is cognitive changes. All right, so cognitive, again, I keep harping on this, but it's something that's very, very important, is cognitive means thinking. Okay, so cognitive changes are kind of changes in intelligence or changing in thinking. And as we kind of go through this, we have to understand that intelligence doesn't necessarily change as we're constantly continuing to learn. So remember when we talked about John Locke and kind of this tabula rasa idea or blank slate, we are constantly having new experiences, therefore building upon our knowledge. All right, so it makes sense as we get older that we don't lose our intelligence, but instead we continue to learn, we continue to grow. All right, so as we age, people are still comprehending new materials, they're thinking flexibly, but we tend to see some complications when the new information kind of contradicts old information. So for example, we typically have a lot of people in older generations have difficulty with changes in technologies because they're finally learning older technologies and then something changes and it's difficult for them to comprehend how quickly things are moving because as soon as they learn something new, a newer technology comes about. So even though they're trying, it takes a little bit longer because they kind of haven't been born with that, and those ideas that they've been ingrained with over time are still kind of there. But when you look at cognitive and creative approaches, those peaks kind of occur in their 40s. So people are the most creative up until their mid 40s, and then it kind of starts to decline as kind of their ways get ingrained in them. So that's cognitive changes. Now socially and personally, it kind of is very dependent on gender and gender identity, according to Daniel Levinson. All right, so Daniel Levinson came up with this theory of male development, and it goes by stages. So before age 22, you are seen as a young man or a boy, not really seen a whole lot in the eyes of being a true man. So once you hit age 22 to 28, you're kind of seen as a novice or a new man. And still kind of learning, and that is why, especially in business and in different jobs, you have apprenticeships and you kind of get taken under somebody's wing in that time frame. Then we look at the brief period of 28 to 30, your commitments are kind of re-examined. So you look in the late 20s and start to see that maybe, messing around or not taking your job seriously or not taking relationships seriously is seen as kind of a negative, and eventually you kind of have to settle down. And so at that time frame, that's when those commitments are kind of re-examined and we start to kind of grow up a little bit. After about age 30, you have the boom phase, which is where you're fully independent. And this is kind of culturally dependent as well. There are certain cultures, such as like the Italian culture, where if you're not married, you're seen to kind of live at home and be kind of taken care of by your mother. In American culture, by about age 30, typically they kind of leave the nest and they're out on their own and being fully independent by that time frame. They have a job, they're usually in some sort of stable relationship, they pay their own bills, and they're kind of seen as being a full man. Then you get to your midlife, which is, again, late 40s, early 50s, and kind of that midlife crisis, if you will, of questioning the past and kind of, did you do everything right? And what are you going to do in the future? And so that questioning sometimes leads to some kind of rash decisions, buying the car or the fancy vehicle or whatever it may be, to kind of revive yourself. That's kind of seen as the midlife crisis. Then we have what's called generativity, which is the next stage. And so that's kind of looking at, okay, we've made our mark. Let's look at what information we have and can pass down to the next generation. So, when you think of a grandfather passing down their wisdom to the grandson or the granddaughter, the next kind of wave of individuals in the next generation, that's kind of that next stage. And then finally you get to stagnation, which is kind of when you get to your late adulthood, and you kind of don't want to return back to the past. You've kind of lost that desire and you're just kind of hanging out, kind of waiting for the end to come, which sounds really depressing, by the way, but that's not that bad. So generally speaking, the middle adulthood is where you're the most stable, both in your job and in your personal lives, and you have a higher toleration of others. With female development, it's not nearly as staged out, but you do still see some kind of experiences and how that kind of influences their development. So as you get older, there's more freedoms and there's fewer demands, especially as the children like you've raised have start to kind of leave the house. It opens up a lot more time to do kind of things that you maybe didn't get to do when you were raising children, travel, trying out new hobbies, things like that. There is a brief period of what's called the empty nest syndrome. And some of you that are kind of getting older, that are starting to maybe see this in your parents, if you are an only child or the youngest, your parents are kind of starting to prepare for their last child leaving the home. And it can be really scary because their role completely changes. They're no longer a caregiver, and the role that they've had for the last 18 plus years of their lives is starting to change, and that can be really scary for adults, just like it's scary for you kids as you're getting ready to kind of leave the nest and go out on your own. It's also scary for your parents because they're fearful for you, and did they do the right thing? Did they raise you right? And all that good stuff. So empty nest syndrome is a real thing, and some of you guys are probably dealing with those consequences right now. So that's our discussion on cognitive, social, and personal development, and we'll have another video here coming up shortly about late adulthood.